My care story started when I was 25. My grandmother fell on tile floor and broke her hip in her home. And after that, she was a wheelchair user until she passed away in September. The reason why I mentioned her is she's truly the inspiration for providing this content and free education to you, um, because I want to help others um, plan for their most successful aging at home process. So I'm curious, what is the first thing you think of when I say aging at home?
I think of like 24-hour coverage because that's what I don't know. I just feel like when you age at home, it becomes like a care system that's needed to support someone aging at home versus like in another setting. And that's where like the concept of like 24 really rings to my mind. Like, hey, how does that coverage look like for someone who wants to age at home? Which I should be able to, but then I start worrying about finances and everything else.
So I'm hearing you say that aging at home might be coverage for 24 hours is likely to be needed, and that's a very expensive process. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I think it sounds like everyone wants to age at home. I just think cost is like a thing that comes naturally as like a secondary thought.
Thank you for that. Elizabeth, would you like to add anything to that?
So for me, the first thing, like if somebody says, "Hey, I want to age at home," I always say, "Okay, that's great, but it's more than putting up grab bars in the shower." So so I'm always thinking about what does aging in place mean to them besides just, okay, I have my home, it's paid off, I'm gonna live in it. So
No,
that's what
that's
I
great.
think. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why I initially created this webinar, is because there's so many complexities when it comes to aging at home. And it's important to, obviously, I won't be able to cover all of the complexities, but if we can get through most of the financial aspects, I think it will really help you through this aging at home process. So we are going to go through 4 different sectors. The first section is covering major expenses. The second one is to fund aging at home. As Juan said, it is expensive. So is there any ways that we can minimize the cost of aging at home? And often overlooked expenses that many people don't account for. It's more than just the grab bars, as Elizabeth said. So what are the 4 biggest expenses of aging at home? Elizabeth, can you name one?
Well, care for sure. That's probably in-home care is the most expensive. Um, Transportation can be extremely expensive as well, because if you're staying at home, but you still need to go out and go places, it's not like when you're living in a retirement community and that maybe then you would have, they have a van to be taking you places. And then if you're not able to drive and or you're in a wheelchair and you need a specific vehicle, that can be extremely expensive.
Yeah, those are great. Thank you. Juan, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think Elizabeth covered it really well. I'm thinking more lately about um, power and electricity, especially with like the rolling blackouts and everything. I know a number of people require medication that's refrigerated or electrical beds or electrical wheelchairs that might have some methods of storage or short-lived, but with seeing so many extreme examples of like hurricanes happening, I know that California is in its own unique spot with natural disasters, both with the fires and with a pending earthquake somewhere on the horizon. I'm just thinking a lot about like emergency preparedness as it relates to like being a big expense, being able to age at home. Because if a disaster strikes, those expensive pieces of infrastructure are what's going to determine a lot of people's ability to be able to stay at their own homes or be forced to move somewhere else afterwards.
Yeah, so what I heard from Elizabeth is the cost of care, the cost of transportation, and Juan, it seems like you're talking about the utilities and also the pending natural disaster that may occur and planning ahead for that. So these are the four major expenses. So care expenses, as Elizabeth said, home modifications, medical expenses, and home maintenance. So when I'm talking with a client about aging at home, I try to make it as simple as possible. So I have four spending buckets. The first one is for taxes, for property taxes. So that's about 1% of the home value, depending on which state and county you live in. Then you're gonna have 1% of home value for maintenance. Now that may fluctuate depending on if you have an older home or a younger home, or maybe you recently just redid one of your appliances, maybe made a total renovation to your home and maintenance isn't as much of a worry for you. Or it could be you haven't maintained your home in years and you may need to put a little bit more into that bucket. Then you have the cost of care bucket. And especially for California, that can be extremely expensive. And then based off of a Fidelity study, they're estimating medical expenses to be about $6,500 for a retiree. But I've obviously seen higher than that as well. That's just an average based on their research study. So here's an example. So if you're someone who has roughly a house, this is maybe larger in California, but let's just go for a hypothetical situation. Your home is worth 600,000 and you need 24-hour care. So in these four buckets, it would be the first one would be $6,000 for property taxes, $6,000 for yearly maintenance, 260,000 for 24-hour care, approximately if you need care for 24 hours at $30 an hour. That can fluctuate based off of what care agencies you use and whether you use care agencies or independent care workers. And then we have the health expense at the end. Did you notice that I might be missing one of the original expenses that we talked about earlier, the biggest expenses? If not, it's okay. So in this presentation, I missed the home modifications bucket. And the reason why I don't create this as a bucket is because what I do with clients is I either do a virtual run through around their house or an in-person tour of their house. And we have an Excel spreadsheet together and we estimate some of the changes that they may want to make on their home to make sure that it's age in place, aging at home prepared. And if we want a more detailed estimate, we will look into getting someone who is a certified aging in place specialist or a contractor to help give specific amounts. But as Elizabeth mentioned, it's usually not just the grab bar that's needed, but it can range to be very expensive. Juan, you had a question?
Yeah, because that's what I was thinking too. I imagine it's like extremely personalized based off like individuals' needs or upcoming or future needs, and sometimes you could even predict the future. Maybe it's a grab bar today, maybe it's you know, see up a staircase tomorrow. But I think the idea behind it is that it probably varies a lot. Are there like not so much like the window, but like averages of like, hey, this is typically the services that are like baseline, or this is like if it's more so related to like wheelchair accessibility, this is what it might cost, or Because I know those are like unique like modifications of like doorway expansion and other things. And just I know it's probably really hard because there's so many like case by case scenarios, but is there like a general window limit, or like I'm just trying to get a sense of like common home modifications?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just from my experience personally, I've just seen such a range that would be hard to predict an average. Easily a kitchen or a bathroom renovation could easily be over $100,000 nowadays. Um, so it really depends on the scope and the project of the home. And we'll talk about less expensive ways to age at home.
One thing that I would throw out there too is that when I'm looking at it with a client, a lot of times we'll look at, okay, so this is what it's going to cost to stay in your home, and this is what it's going to cost for you to move out of your home and move to, you know, a, a retirement community. Because a lot of times people think, well, it's not just that they want to stay in their home, but they think it's less expensive to stay in their home. And until they really see, like from someone like you, Danielle, where you say, okay, this is what it truly costs you just to keep your home, and then we have to add these modifications on top, versus this is what it would cost you to live in a retirement community. So I always want to give them both sides of it, because that also helps as well with, okay, well, we think we want to stay in our home to say this point in our lives, what that may be, but then will go to a retirement community. So then they have some kind of financial idea of, you know, what that may be. And one of the other things, like you said, Daniel, it's so different across the board with everybody's homes. Is it new? Is it old? Have they done anything? Have they not? The other big one is if they live in a condo or a townhome, there may be possible issues that they can't make appropriate updates to age in place based on CCNRs or their HOA to allow them to put a ramp in the front of their condo or their townhome.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for adding that context. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
So these are the most common ways to pay for aging at home. Obviously, this doesn't exert all of them. These are just the most common. We have long-term care insurance. The only downside of that is you're trading comfort for most of the time expensive premiums. So if you want financial security and knowing that there'll be something available to you when you need long-term care, that is the safest route to go. For Americans, oh, and I forgot to mention about the long-term care insurance. Most of the time, it doesn't cover 100% of coverage. So you still may be paying some portion of amount out of your pocket. For my grandmother, when she had long-term care insurance, 75% was covered, but she still paid $6,000 out of pocket. So just be careful that you're going to have a waiting period in which you'll have to cover your own amount, as well as a portion monthly that you'll have to pay out of pocket. Juan, did you have a question or wanted to add something?
Yeah, and I feel this could make a longer later conversation, especially with long-term care insurance being one of the things that we're working on as far as having like a public system. Um, how often is it like actually like cover or not cover? Because that's where I've heard a lot of like stories about like coverage being good, coverage being bad, coverage being next to nothing in some cases after folks have been paying into it for like years, and then when they actually needed to use it, it's like, hey, it actually is covering a small percentage of the overall cost, and now you're in a pickle where your understanding of your policy was different than what was actually available when you needed it. And I know those are really heartbreaking stories to hear about, where it starts involving home equity and personal savings and government programs on folks' head. wanted to be more independent and we're relying on that long-term care insurance as like that system.
Yeah, it's a really hard one. Unfortunately, there are a lot of bad apples, as there are in every industry. And sometimes you'll get a really good long-term care insurance expert, or I call them sales representatives, that will be able to walk you through exactly what your contract says so you understand it. Some will just say, this is what I think you need, and they're persuaded to buy that policy. And so most of the time that I've seen with my clients that have long-term care insurance policies that have bought, since I don't sell it, that have bought it through somebody else, they don't understand their contracts. And understanding your contract is key to ensuring that actual coverage is going to benefit you. There's downsides to all of these buckets, which is the hard part in making some of these decisions because it's so expensive, but none of these buckets are a very happy solution. It's just kind of a mediocre or a satisfactory decision. So I'll walk with clients through this process and we'll decide together what they think is best. For Americans, their largest assets are their homes. So taking a line of credit on their home or taking a second mortgage or getting a reverse mortgage can be an option. Unfortunately, with the higher interest rates like it is now, that may not be a possibility for many people. I would also be careful, just like we talked about the long-term care insurance policies. Reverse mortgages can also be very complicated. So understanding those contracts, getting a second opinion, or hiring me for an hour to read the policy so that you understand what you're getting into before you sign that contract. And then with personal savings, there are potential, if you're not planning appropriately, that you may have a high tax liability because you're pulling a lot out of your retirement accounts, or you're pulling money from investments where you wouldn't normally, because your normal income is maybe, let's say, 60 to 80,000 per year, but now you're pulling out $260,000 additionally to cover care. So things can add up really quickly tax-wise, especially when you're in California. And then government programs. I think a lot of people assume that government programs are just going to save the day and help them out. And they haven't looked or planned ahead to see if they qualify for the benefits that the government programs provide. So it's really important to ensure that if that's the route you want to go in utilizing these benefits, that you understand whether or not you qualify and what's available for you within those programs. So I thought it'd be helpful to create a hypothetical situation. Meeting Dorothy, she is 75 and she has limited savings and she wants to modify her home. So how can Dorothy minimize her cost and still live comfortably? Now, I'm not saying these are perfect solutions. There may be just a Band-Aid to put on top of your skin, but will not cover the total solution. So I just thought they would be helpful to go through together. So in order to minimize costs, I do suggest to use aging in place specialists and financial advisors combined to really see what your situation is. The most common thing I see people not using is equipment loaner programs. When my grandmother passed away, we had in the care equipment galore. Her whole garage was full of care equipment. And I realized how wasteful that can be, especially when you're experimenting on many different types of care equipment. I wish we would have utilized a program like the equipment loaner programs that are in many communities that provide loan and just care equipment for free to access to you. And usually those are at senior community centers or can be at fire departments. As we say in the financial industry, health is wealth. So making sure that you're not forgetting to focus on the small things that can make you healthier and decrease your risk of needing care in the future. So simple things like doing annual doctor's checkups or daily exercises can make a real difference. So if you were Dorothy, which one would you try out to minimize your aging at home cost?
Technology.
Technology. Yeah, that's a great one. It's my favorite. How about you, Juan?
No, science technology.
Yeah, there are a lot of really great resources for using technology in the home. My parents have a bunch, like for Amazon Prime Day, they bought a bunch of Amazon Echoes and they have it throughout their house. Turn on all the lights for them, do alerts and medication reminders. There's a lot of simple things you can do with very inexpensive devices nowadays. So what we don't forget, there's a lot of things that many people forget to include in their aging plan process that quickly add up over time. When I was caring for my grandmother, I couldn't believe how expensive adult underwear, wipes, and gloves added up so quickly. It felt like we were paying just constantly, just running through them really quickly. The common thing I see most people don't preparing for is inflation. They may think that care is a certain cost one year, but once they re-sign the contract or the care agency sends them a note saying that they're going to raise their prices, that's when people get scared and go, oh no, it's inflation. So prepare for it ahead of time. Don't prepare for it when you receive that letter. So everything we talked about thus far is just going to go down the drain unless you communicate what your wishes are. Here are the most common ways that I suggest clients to demonstrate their long-term care wishes. My favorite is using if-then statements. So if you're someone who wants to tell their children that you want to age in place, maybe start with, if I need a knee replacement, then I would like you to pick me up from the hospital. And it can go the reverse way for a kid to adult, to a parent. If you need care in the future, how would you want care to be provided to you? So I think that's a simple way to educate and communicate wishes. The goal is to plant seeds, not move boulders. The more you plant seeds, the better. So I would love to hear one takeaway that you learned from this presentation and answer any questions you may have.